Josh Miller raised the old flag at dawn, its fabric whispering against a spring breeze as the sun touched the rooftop of Milltown. The pole gave a soft groan as the line tightened, nothing too dramatic, just the kind of aged creak that came from wood weathered by many winters. Josh paused for a breath, resting his hand on the worn finish. That sound had greeted him since he was a boy. The same lean of the flagpole, the same rasp of rope, the same quiet presence in front of his grandfather's porch. "Still standing, old friend," he murmured, eyes trailing the flag as it unfurled into morning light. The grass shimmered faintly with dew. Lilac bushes lining the edge of the property trembled gently in the breeze, releasing a scent that reminded Josh of spring Saturdays with his grandfather, pruning shears in one hand, old military radio playing somewhere inside. The house itself hadn't changed much, two-story colonial brick, white trim paint flaking at the edges, a front stoop with 3 steps and one uneven rail. It didn't look like much, but it had stood through more than most things in Milltown. Josh wiped his palms against the sides of his khakis and looked across the narrow street. The neighborhood was still quiet. A few porch lights remained on. From down the block, the clink of silverware and the hum of a radio meant Old Glory's was open. He'd stop by for coffee in a bit. For now, he just stood there, arms crossed, letting the flag settle into its morning sway. It was supposed to be a small gesture. A private way to honor his grandfather's 100-day memorial. Not some spectacle. Josh had cleared the patch of grass himself the week before, cleaned and repainted the base of the pole, reknotted the halyard rope. The flag had been kept folded in a triangle under his bed since the funeral, untouched since the honor guard last saluted it. He wasn't expecting company, but of course, Clarice Dugan never missed a walk. She came around the corner in pressed khaki slacks and a pale visor, sunglasses perched despite the low sun. Clarice was the kind of neighbor who kept laminated checklists of acceptable paint tones and wind chime volume decibel levels. HOA president for 6 years running, head of seasonal flower bed inspections, and fond of the phrase, enforcing community standards. Her footsteps paused sharply at the edge of his lawn. "That flagpole wasn't approved," she said without greeting. Josh turned slightly. "It's been here since before the HOA was established." "That doesn't make it grandfathered." She used the word like a cudgel, like it had quotation marks and scorn baked into every syllable. "You should have filed a structural request." "It was already here," Josh said, keeping his voice calm. "I just repainted it." She made a note in a small notebook. "Modifications still fall under visual alterations. It violates Section 8 of the Aesthetic Integrity Clause." Josh blinked. "The what?" Clarice adjusted her sunglasses. "Page 12 of the handbook. You'll receive a notice." He watched her walk off with quick, precise strides, like each step was weighed for efficiency. Josh stayed on the porch a moment longer, flag flapping lightly above him, then exhaled and went inside. By the time he reached Old Glory's cafe, the smell of baked cinnamon apples and buttery pastry filled the air. He took his usual seat by the window. Old Mr. Albert was there, 2 booths down, hunched over a crossword and sipping black coffee. They exchanged brief nods. Albert didn't speak much since his stroke the year before, but he still came in daily. At the counter, Josh left a crisp $2 bill beneath his empty cup. "People don't just pay for food," he told the young waitress, who looked too new to know his name. "They pay for kindness." She smiled politely, not quite sure how to respond. Josh stepped back into the late morning light, halfway to his mailbox when he saw the envelope tucked into the doorframe. Plain white. HOA logo on the upper left. He already knew what it would say. The letter cited non-compliance with visual uniformity, referencing a subsection about non-regulated vertical installations. It ordered him to remove the flagpole within 72 hours to avoid escalating fines. No mention of history. No recognition of its presence for decades. Just bland threats buried in technical phrasing. Back inside, Josh took the folder marked House Docs from the desk drawer and started flipping through tabs: property survey, zoning permits, scanned correspondence from 2007. He stopped at a faded photocopy of a photograph, his grandfather, standing beside the same flagpole, saluting in a blue cap during a Memorial Day event. The date on the bottom corner read 1999. He laid the photo flat. His grandfather had always said, "If the foundation's good, you don't tear down the post just because it's not in fashion." Josh didn't know all the clauses in the HOA handbook. But he knew this pole wasn't about fashion. He picked up his phone and typed in Milltown HOA appeal process. A knock interrupted him. Ted Hawkins stood there, baseball cap in hand. "Hey," Ted said. Saw Clarice with her clipboard. "Everything okay?" Josh hesitated. "She says the pole's against regulations." Ted frowned. "That thing's been here longer than she has." Josh nodded. "I'm gonna fight it." "Well, if you need help, let me know." Ted offered a small wave and turned down the walkway. Josh watched him go, then looked up at the flag again. That night, he read through the HOA handbook front to back. It was dense and vague and full of legalese that meant everything and nothing. And there it was, the clause, Section 8, Visual Uniformity. He highlighted a line that read, "No exterior installation exceeding 4 feet in vertical length shall be permitted without prior written approval." Josh measured the pole the next morning. It was 5 feet 2 inches. By 2 inches, he was out of compliance. But further down, in Appendix D, there was a clause about historical structures. If he could prove the pole was of community heritage value, it might qualify for exemption. It was flimsy, but it was something. He tapped the edge of the handbook thoughtfully. The HOA might have written the rules. But his grandfather always taught him how to read between them. He didn't hear Clarice approach until she was at the edge of the lawn again. Either the pole goes, or the fines start piling up. In the attic, among medals and yellowed photographs, Josh found a photo of a younger Senator Freeman, shaking hands with his grandfather. The image had been tucked between a certificate for community service and a faded flyer from the Milltown 4th of July Parade, 1986. Josh held it gently by the edges. Senator Freeman, decades younger, wearing a blazer too big for her, was smiling awkwardly beside Staff Sergeant Robert Miller, who stood straight and proud in his civilian slacks and veteran's cap. The cardboard box that held the photo was one of many stacked against the attic's rear wall. Josh had come up hoping to find something, anything, that could help him build a case. He hadn't expected this. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, and the single bulb overhead cast long shadows on the wood-paneled eaves. Wind tapped softly against the small window as he sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by bits of his grandfather's life. On the back of the photo, in neat block letters, Civic Youth Debate Finals, May 1998. Robert sponsored Delia Freeman's trip to Montpelier. Josh thought back to something his grandfather once told him when they'd stood in line for pancakes on Memorial Day years ago. "Symbols aren't for parades," he'd said, tapping the brim of his cap. "They're reminders of sacrifice." Below that memory lay a man who sponsored teenagers' civic dreams while keeping a lawn flag upright in the muddiest months. Back downstairs, Josh spread out the contents of the attic boxes on the dining table. He sorted photos into piles, labeling them with post-it notes. Medals. Commendations. Community awards. One envelope held a copy of a letter from the governor, dated 1999, thanking Robert Miller for long-standing service in support of civic and veteran initiatives in the Green Mountain region. By mid-morning, he needed coffee. Old Glory's was bustling in its usual slow, shuffling way. A small brass bell announced his entry, and a woman behind the counter with bright red glasses gave him a smile. "Morning, dear," she said. "The usual?" "Make it 2 slices of maple pie," Josh replied. "One to go." He carried the wrapped box down the street in a brown paper bag, still warm. At the edge of Mr. Albert's porch, he knocked once, heard nothing, and gently left the pie on the ledge with a note that read, "Thought of your favorite." Albert had been his grandfather's neighbor for over 40 years, but they hadn't spoken much in the past few. Old tensions lingered, like creaky floorboards. When Josh had raised the flag again, he'd caught Albert looking over with a hard, unreadable expression from behind his newspaper. Not disapproval exactly. But certainly not pride. That afternoon, Josh headed to the Milltown Library. The municipal records room was tucked in the back corner, behind a shelf labeled Church Histories, and across from a dusty microfilm reader. A young woman with auburn braids and a cardigan that seemed too large for her frame looked up as he approached. "Hi," he said. "I'm looking for town records, community service awards, newspaper mentions, anything on Robert Miller." She nodded. "We've got digitized newspaper archives from 1980 on. I can help you pull specifics if you have dates." Josh handed her a note card with a few ranges. She disappeared behind the desk. As he waited, he walked the aisles. Under a glass case was the town's charter, a quilt stitched by local veterans' wives in the 70s, and a typed list of Milltown's founding families. None of it grand, but all of it personal. Clarissa's flyers appeared that evening. They were taped to lampposts and slid under doors. HOA compliance notice, non-conforming structure violation, the header read in bold serif font. Below, a photo of Josh's house, Cotco highlighted in red. He pulled one down from the post near Albert's mailbox and sighed. It felt like war by paper cut. Josh returned to his kitchen, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and started drafting a letter. "Dear Senator Freeman, I don't know if you remember Milltown. You probably don't remember my grandfather either. But I believe you knew him once, when you were very young. He believed in small towns, in civic duty, in flying the flag because of what it meant, not just because of where it stood." The next morning, he printed the letter, attached copies of the photo, the certificate, and the governor's commendation. He scanned everything into one clean PDF and uploaded it to the senator's official inquiry page under Civic Heritage Proposals. He took a deep breath, hit submit, and sat back in his chair. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. That evening, Josh returned to the porch. The pie box he'd left for Albert was gone. No word, no note, but the porch light next door blinked on as he stepped outside. The sun had dipped low behind Milltown's rooftops. The flag stirred gently, casting a long, quiet shadow down the lawn. Back inside, Josh's phone buzzed. Subject, Heritage Flagpole Inquiry, Office of Senator Freeman. "We're looking into it. The senator has taken personal interest." 3 days later, a black sedan pulled into Milltown. Inside, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone used to being heard. The vehicle paused at the corner where Maple and Union intersected, engine humming softly as if waiting for the town to recognize its passenger. Windows down, a hand emerged holding a folded paper map. After a glance, the sedan continued slowly, passing familiar porches and blooming yards until it came to a full stop outside Old Glory's. Josh was seated by the window when she stepped out. She wore a navy blazer over a chambray blouse, dark slacks, and low brown heels that made a crisp sound on the sidewalk. She didn't look around like a stranger. She looked like someone returning to a place she'd left unfinished. He knew her face from the news. From the photo in his attic. From the signature at the bottom of the email. Senator Delia Freeman walked through Old Glory's door with the kind of calm that made people straighten their posture without realizing why. "Excuse me," she said to the counter, "can I borrow a minute of Josh Miller's time?" Josh stood so fast he knocked his coffee. "Yes, of course, yes." Outside, the sun sat high but gentle, dappling the sidewalk with shade from the elm trees that had lined the street since before Josh was born. She walked with him past the post office and down a side path that led to the HOA clubhouse. A sign taped to the glass read, "Special Session, HOA Executive Board." As they reached the steps, Freeman paused. 3 weeks ago," she said, "a letter crossed my desk. Simple, handwritten, polite. Attached were records older than most of my staff." Josh smiled nervously. "I didn't expect you'd actually come. You said something in that letter." She looked at him with the precision of someone who didn't waste eye contact. "You may not remember him, but you once said my grandfather taught you to fight fair, fight proud." He nodded. "I found the photo. From the debate finals in '98. I hadn't thought about that day in decades," Freeman said. But yes. I remember. Inside the clubhouse, folding chairs were arranged in a makeshift horseshoe. On the table, pitchers of sweet tea, platters of cornbread, a bowl of lemon wedges. Ted stood near the back, arms crossed. Clarice Dugan was already seated at the center table, flanked by two members of the HOA board. She glanced up at Freeman and immediately frowned. "Senator," Clarice said with practiced politeness, "we appreciate your interest, but this is a local matter." "I'm not here to disrupt," Freeman replied. "Just to clarify." The room fell still as she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a file folder, laying its contents before the board: copies of civic commendations, letters of record, and the 1999 gubernatorial recognition signed in blue ink. Josh stood quietly at the edge of the room. The laminated flyer Clarice had posted the day before still curled at the edges of the bulletin board: "Unregistered vertical installment equals violation." Freeman spoke. "I'm here today because this town has preserved more than just its charm. It preserved service. Staff Sergeant Robert Miller wasn't just a veteran, he was a civic anchor. And that flagpole? It's a modest marker of something this country desperately needs: continuity." Clarice stood, hands flat on the table. "With all due respect, she's not even from here anymore." "I grew up on Elm Street," Freeman said evenly. "My mother used to cut your hair in the back of the old pharmacy. And I've voted in this district every year since I turned 18. Clarice flushed. Ted shifted his weight but said nothing. Josh stepped forward and laid his grandfather's folded service flag gently on the table. "This is what flew from that pole when he passed," he said. "It wasn't just a decoration. It was a tribute." Freeman nodded, eyes scanning the room. "And I intend to submit a proposal next week to the State Committee on Cultural Heritage requesting designation of this flagpole as a protected civic marker." A murmur swept through the room. Clarice's voice cracked slightly. "This is a neighborhood, not a battlefield museum." The silence that followed was colder than anything the spring air could bring. A few people looked away. One woman folded her hands. Another sipped iced tea too quickly. Freeman turned toward Clarice, voice calm but firm. "Then why does it feel like someone's fighting to erase history?" Senator Freeman stood at the front of the clubhouse, holding up a faded photograph. "I was 15. He changed my life." The air in the room seemed to hold still with her words. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the soft murmurs and shifting of plastic chairs like a bell before a funeral prayer. She didn't have notes, only the photograph in one hand and her old brown leather briefcase resting by her feet. Josh stood near the back, iced tea sweating in his hand, eyes fixed on the back of her head. She wore a pale blue shirt with the collar gently folded, sleeves rolled, no pin, no podium. Just presence. "Robert Miller," she continued, "stood in the back row during our town's high school debate finals. I didn't win. I was too nervous, too fast. But afterward, he shook my hand and told me I had a spine worth keeping straight." A few older residents nodded, some in recognition, others in simple respect. Josh remembered his grandfather saying something not far off. "When you're right, you don't shout, you stand still and let others lean in." It echoed now inside him louder than Freeman's calm delivery. Outside the clubhouse windows, a trio of teenagers stood on the lawn holding cardboard signs: "Let it fly." One of them was Josh's cousin's son, wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big and a smile that wasn't about politics. Freeman gently set the photo on the table. "This town remembers its own," she said. "This pole, this flag, it isn't just an object. It marks something you chose to honor every year without being told." Clarice cleared her throat from the front row. "We appreciate the sentiment, Senator, but this is a private residential matter. The Homeowners Association has guidelines." Freeman nodded. "So do we, at the state level. And we believe in preserving symbols that reflect communal values." Josh stepped forward with a paper folder, carefully removing a laminated certificate. This is the commendation he received in '98 from the Office of Veteran Affairs. It recognizes his years of volunteer service across 4 counties. Ted Hawkins sat straighter at that. His wife, seated next to him, leaned over to read it. Clarice stood abruptly. "We all respect Mr. Miller's service," she said, her tone tightening like a drawstring. "But this isn't about what happened 30 years ago. It's about enforcing rules fairly. No structure should get special treatment." "I agree," Freeman said, without skipping a beat. "That's why I've proposed this flagpole be added to the State Registry of Civic Markers. Under Vermont law, any physical installation commemorating veteran contribution, maintained for over 20 years, qualifies." A ripple moved through the room. Chairs shifted. Backs straightened. Josh kept his eyes on Clarice, whose lips parted but no words came. Then, predictably, she stepped forward. "This is a neighborhood," she said, voice rising, "not a battlefield museum." Freeman's tone didn't change. "It's a neighborhood full of stories. And some stories deserve a place to stand." Albert, seated near the exit, gave a faint but visible nod. He held his usual newspaper folded tight across his knee. For the first time in a long while, he spoke without being asked. "Bob gave me that flag in 2001, he said, voice gruff and deliberate. "After my son didn't make it home. Told me it would fly until we remembered what for." Clarice spun back toward the board. "I motion for a vote to remove the pole by Monday. If we wait, the state process will delay enforcement." Ted looked up. "You want us to vote on tearing down someone's tribute while the senator's sitting here?" "The senator," Clarice snapped, "isn't from Milltown anymore." Freeman tilted her head. "That's true. But I carry it everywhere I go." Josh let the silence hang for a beat before speaking. "This isn't just for my grandfather. It's for what he stood for. What Albert just said. What Freeman carried with her all these years. If the rules matter, then so do the reasons they were written." Murmurs followed. A woman in a floral blouse passed a tray of cornbread along the left row. Someone poured sweet tea into paper cups from a glass pitcher. It felt more like a church social than a civic confrontation, but that was the town's way, quiet, slow, but rooted. "I've submitted the paperwork," Freeman added. "It's under review with the State Cultural Committee. You'll receive a formal notice by Wednesday." Clarice's jaw tightened. She turned to the crowd, scanning faces she'd once considered predictable. Ted leaned back and said, just loud enough, "Maybe we should wait before we vote." Clarice raked her fingers through her hair, then grabbed her bag from the chair. As she turned, her voice rang sharper than intended, slicing through the goodwill like a paper cut. "Senator or not, this pole comes down Monday." At dawn, Josh found the flag crumpled in the grass. The halyard had been slashed clean through. He stood barefoot on the porch steps, the early light brushing the edges of his face as he took in the limp cloth and the coiled rope that had once held it aloft. The cut was clean, too precise for accident, too pointed to be mistaken for wind or wear. He knelt, picked up the flag gently, and folded it the way his grandfather had taught him, 3 sharp triangles, no frayed corners exposed. The pole swayed slightly, its top bare and quiet. The wound wasn't in the wood. It was in the message. Inside, he laid the flag on the kitchen table, filled a mug with lukewarm coffee, and sat for a long moment. Outside, the sound of sprinklers started up from neighboring lawns. Birds called through the still thin trees. Life continued, even when it tried to look away. Josh remembered what Clarice had once said during a HOA meeting about an unapproved wind sculpture in a neighbor's yard. "We remove violations, quietly if needed." At the time, it had drawn uneasy laughter. Now, it echoed with weight. By 9 a.m., the pole was restrung with new halyard from a hardware store down in East Bar. Josh used his lunch break to re-raise the flag, tying the knots with care, stepping back to check the tension twice. This time, it climbed upward with a small defiance, its edges snapping a little sharper in the breeze. Ted showed up shortly after noon, hat in hand. He didn't walk all the way to the porch, just stopped near the gate and leaned one arm over it like he had nowhere better to be. "I heard what happened," he said after a pause. Josh looked up from where he was sweeping bark mulch back into the garden line. "Wasn't expecting support." Ted shrugged. Wasn't planning to offer it until now. Josh rested the broom. What changed? I think it's time I stood for something, Ted said. He looked over at the flag, then back at Josh. If this is how they treat a family that's been here longer than the road signs, I don't want to be quiet anymore. Josh nodded. It wasn't a speech, but it was enough. Later that afternoon, as he stepped out to check the mailbox, he nearly tripped over a small wooden box left on the front step. Weathered oak, old hinges, no note, until he lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded flag, different from his own, deeper blue, edges stiff with age. And tucked beside it, a single card, I was wrong. He stood for all of us. No signature, but Josh knew the handwriting. Mr. Albert. He glanced across the street. The curtain in Albert's window shifted slightly, and then was still. Josh brought the box inside and placed it beside the one from the attic. 2 flags. 2 stories. 1 turning. The next morning, the glass door at Old Glory's swung open with more urgency than usual. The cafe was already half full, every table occupied. Banners hung loosely above the counter, Veterans Corner breakfast, all welcome. People had shown up with homemade muffins, slow cookers of sausage gravy, plastic tubs of fruit salad. Someone brought pancake batter and a griddle. The air smelled of syrup, butter, and neighborly dissent. Josh arrived late, still unsure what to say. Ted waved him over to a long table where clipboards had been laid out beside stacks of petitions. At the top, support flagpole designation, community signature drive. Mrs. Lucy from 2 streets over leaned across the table to sign, then patted Josh's hand. My Harold fought in Korea, she said. He'd called that pole the straightest thing in town. Josh smiled. Albert sat near the end, sipping watery coffee with no sugar, as always. He didn't say much, but he did look up and nod once, slow and steady. The hum of conversation swelled as more residents trickled in. A young woman handed out buttons reading Let It Fly. Children chased each other between chairs, and Josh found himself suddenly holding a plate of cornbread and a flyer about Vermont's Heritage Commission. The town, it seemed, had chosen its side, gently but firmly. Josh was gathering dishes when he heard a quiet voice behind him. Clarice just called an emergency vote, to expel you from the neighborhood. Josh stood at the back of the room, heart steady as Clarice's voice cut through the air. The board recommends removal, not just of the pole, but of the owner. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. The HOA meeting room, normally echoing only with light chatter and the occasional chair scrape, felt heavy with tension. Rows of white plastic chairs groaned under the weight of neighbors leaning forward. Josh's hands were folded in front of him, unmoving, as he watched Clarice glide between tables like a conductor readying for a final movement. Behind her, on the temporary corkboard set against the back wall, was a sign printed in large blue letters, Protected Heritage Request, pending approval. Beneath it, the flag flew again. Neatly tied. Unwavering. The room had been arranged hastily. The camera on a short bookshelf streamed to a YouTube page the HOA had only recently learned to manage. The city attorney appeared in a Zoom window projected on the wall, arms folded, lips pressed tight. Clarice wore a tailored blazer and carried a leather-bound folder thick with printed bylaws. She tapped the folder with a manicured finger as she spoke. It is within this board's discretion to determine what destabilizes harmony. The recent disruptions, unauthorized signage, and escalated petitioning suggest a loss of alignment with our community's vision. Josh said nothing. Just watched. From the back of the room, Albert coughed. Ted adjusted his ball cap but didn't speak yet. Mrs. Lucy clutched her handbag tighter than usual. Josh inhaled slowly. Then stepped forward, unfolding a sheet of lined paper. His voice was quiet but carried. My grandfather left this letter with the flag when he stepped down from the Town Veterans Committee, Josh said. He wrote, freedom isn't noisy. It just never backs down. Clarice frowned. This is a meeting, not a eulogy. Josh held her gaze. It's the same thing, sometimes. The words weren't clever. But they landed. People looked at him, not through him. Clarice moved to the podium again, tapping the microphone. We are proceeding with a motion for removal. A two-part vote, first, on the unauthorized flagpole. Second, on the sustained disruptive behavior of its owner, Mr. Miller. A few murmurs stirred. The city attorney's voice echoed from the wall speaker. Just a reminder, expulsion from a homeowners association is a serious measure. It should be handled under Article 9 with 2-week notice and an opportunity for written defense. Clarice smiled tightly. Our bylaws allow for emergency sessions. Josh didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly toward the rows behind him. I've said my part. The rest is up to you. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was gathering. Weight shifting. Ted stood first. I move we let the flag stay. A second later, Lucy raised her hand. Let Josh stay, too. Another voice, you can't vote out someone for remembering their own family. Clarice slammed her hand flat on the table. You don't understand. This isn't about sentiment, it's about order. Rules. There's a political play at work here. She turned toward Josh, eyes blazing. You think you're clever. You brought in the senator. You started the petitions. You've embarrassed this neighborhood. Albert's voice came then. Steady, hoarse. We embarrassed ourselves the moment we made a flag feel like a threat. Clarice looked as if she might speak again, but the room was moving without her. The HOA secretary stood with a clipboard. We'll conduct a simple show of hands. Those in favor of removing the flagpole? 4 hands rose. 1 wavered, then lowered. Those in favor of keeping the pole and tabling the motion against Mr. Miller? Nearly every hand went up. Clarice stared, eyes darting between faces she once counted as allies. Her folder closed with a soft but final thunk. Josh didn't smile. Just stepped back and nodded to the secretary. The camera's red light blinked slowly as the vote was logged. That night, back home, Josh sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and the soft buzz of late news on the radio. His inbox chimed once. The subject line read, Your application for historic civic marker has been approved. On Memorial Day morning, the flag rose slowly to full height. Under it, dozens of folding chairs faced the sun and the past. The fabric caught the early light just as the trumpet cadence from the high school band faded down the street. Josh gave the halyard one final tug, knotting it neatly as his grandfather had taught him. The pole stood silent and certain in the gentle morning breeze. He stepped back. The grass, freshly trimmed, held dew like glass beads. Each folding chair had been wiped down and angled precisely toward the house. No stage. No platform. Just the flag. And stories. Neighbors filtered in, dressed in their Sunday best. Old men with canes, children holding paper programs. A group of Girl Scouts handed out poppies clipped to ribbon pins. The cafe had a folding table set up near the curb with styrofoam cups of weak coffee and plates of poppy pie, cherry and almond in a buttery crust, served free to anyone wearing a veteran badge. Josh adjusted the silver tie at his collar. It had once belonged to his grandfather, tucked away with an old Sunday suit and the kind of things people wore when they knew photographs might be taken. At 9:15, Ted stepped to the front with a sheet of paper slightly curled at the corners. This flag stayed, he said, pausing to scan the crowd. So did we. Applause came softly at first, like a rustle, then grew firm. Even Albert clapped, his hands slower but resolute. A middle school student with a trombone played a few bars of taps. Then 2 high schoolers stepped forward and began reading a list, names of Milltown veterans who had passed in the last decade. A girl's voice cracked slightly midway through. No one minded. The sound system crackled once as the big screen under the porch awning lit up. Senator Freeman appeared, seated at her desk with the state seal behind her. Her hair was neatly pulled back, her voice clear despite the morning feed. Legacy isn't given, she said, it's guarded. And when a town chooses to honor service over silence, it tells the next generation that memory matters. That place matters. A few people dabbed at their eyes. Josh stepped up, hands folded, then carefully unveiled the new brass plaque mounted at the base of the pole. It gleamed against the wood, freshly oiled. In honor of Staff Sergeant Robert Miller, 1941 to 2023. Veteran. Neighbor. Teacher. Defender of quiet courage. The silence after the reveal was fuller than applause. Then Albert stood, walked slowly forward with the wooden box he'd once left on Josh's porch. This time, he handed it directly to the librarian from Milltown's town archive. "For the record," he said. The woman nodded and placed the flag, folded perfectly, into a velvet-lined display case. It would hang near the town's original charter and the framed photo of Freeman and Miller, now newly restored. Clarice was not present. No one spoke of her. But near the back, 3 members of the HOA board spoke in hushed tones, and one, Mrs. Dillard, stood before the group to quietly announce, "In the coming weeks, we'll be restructuring leadership. This isn't how we want to be remembered." Josh didn't reply. He only bowed his head and returned to his seat beside Ted. As the crowd began to disperse, some lingering over pie, others hugging and shaking hands, a small boy with freckled cheeks tugged at Josh's sleeve. "Can I learn to fold the flag like that?" Josh mimiced coy. "You just volunteered, soldier." In a quiet corner of the town library, under soft light, a small display case now held a folded flag and a handwritten note. The glass reflected only a faint amber glow from the ceiling lamps. On the shelf behind it sat a row of war memoirs, a school yearbook from 1987, and a faded program from a Memorial Day ceremony 3 decades old. The flag inside was pressed flat, creases sharp, blue field facing outward. Below it, a yellowed sheet of paper bore steady handwriting in black ink: "If we forget, we repeat. If we remember, we stand." RM. Josh had stood there longer than he meant to. It was a Tuesday morning, and the library was nearly empty, just one elderly man in the newspaper corner and a student sketching diagrams on a Chromebook. The exhibit, titled "Quiet Courage," had been assembled with care. No fanfare. No ceremony. Just belonging. Outside, the sun hung low enough to slant through windows without glare. Josh stepped away, pausing to straighten a bookmark someone had left crooked on the librarian's desk. He walked home along Ash Lane, past porch planters overflowing with geraniums and flags tucked into window boxes. Children on bikes zipped through driveways, their laughter trailing behind like summer wind. The backyard had changed. What was once just grass and a lonely pole was now a shared space. Someone had donated 2 benches. Ted had helped lay a gravel path. Mr. Albert, now attending most meetings silently but faithfully, had ordered solar lights. And Josh had added a modest wooden sign, hand-carved, Veterans Memorial Corner, EST 2023. That evening, a small group of middle schoolers arrived in pairs. Some on foot, some dropped off by minivans. Josh greeted each with a clipboard and a smile. It was their first meeting of Stories of Quiet Courage, a new weekly program held on the cafe's side patio. Inside Old Glory's, the smell of cinnamon and coffee hung thick in the air. The owner, in her usual polka-dot apron, poured lemonade and reminded anyone who asked that Robert Miller used to sit in the very chair by the window every 3rd Wednesday, right after his haircut. Josh opened a well-worn book and began to read. Courage isn't always the loudest shout. Sometimes, it's the choice to stay when leaving is easier. Hands went up. One girl asked about his grandfather's medals. Another boy wanted to know why anyone would try to take down a flag in the first place. Josh answered carefully, not with bitterness but with rhythm. There was a man, he said, who held a town together, not by force, but by the way he showed up. Every day. With calm. With patience. With a sense of who we were supposed to be. That flag he raised? It wasn't his pride, it was his promise. A photograph hung near the back of the cafe now, Josh, Ted, and Mr. Albert standing under a cloudy afternoon sky, wiring small lamps to the memorial plaque. They weren't smiling big. Just enough to say, "We showed up." Later that week, Josh sat at his desk, journal open beside a lamp that had once belonged to his grandfather. He turned to the last page. It stayed. So did I. So will others. He closed the journal and rested his palm on its cover for a moment. Then looked out toward the backyard, where the flag still moved with quiet dignity against a deepening sky. The breeze caught it just enough to unfurl once more. The flag rose. The town remembered. In the quiet that followed Memorial Day, the flag still flew, no longer just for one man, but for a town that had remembered how to stand. It wasn't courtroom drama or loud defiance that won the day, but steady courage and the voices of neighbors who chose legacy over rules misused. When we guard what matters gently but firmly, even the smallest corners of America become sacred ground. Perhaps it's not about winning the fight, but about showing up with grace when it counts. Like an old flag raised in the morning sun, dignity doesn't shout, it simply waves.